This week on the Film Frat podcast, we're talking about rethinking science fiction and fantasy. Now, these are two things that you might be easily confused by. You might not easily recognize the difference between the two, but today we are going to talk a bit about not just the genre of science fiction or the genre of fantasy, but rather the production of each genre, and not just focusing on what is typical in that genre, but how can you experiment with that as a foundation? What is science fiction as we know it, and how can we make it our own? And today we are speaking with a member of faculty from the University of California, San Diego. He is in the visual arts department there, and he teaches classes under media and filmmaking and production in general. His name is Michael Trigilio, and funny enough, he's actually a professor I had the pleasure of learning from in one of his classes. So I took a class from him called Strategies of Alterity. It was a class about otherness, about alienness. What is something that we can define as otherworldly, basically. And the whole focus of the class was on science fiction, and that's something that's under Trigilio's passions. He's also into fantasy, but mostly science fiction. So today, if you're ready to hear about science fiction and Star Wars and Mass Effect and all of that good stuff, you are in for a treat this episode. So take notes, because we are going to learn about how to develop an effective work of science fiction and fantasy. Here we go. This is episode 24 of the Film Frat podcast. Let's go.
This is the Film Fraternity Podcast, a show that's all about filmmaking in college, so you can turn your student projects into powerful portfolios. And now, here's the host of Film Frat House, Zach Sabo.
Hey, welcome back to the show. And if you're new here, I just want to remind you of something. First of all, if you can see this, I shaved. Okay, if you can't see it because you're listening to the audio version, it's because there's actually a video version of this podcast. I know that's a very lame plug transition to what is the Film Frat Patreon page at patreon.com/filmfrat. We have a page where you can see all the video versions of this podcast by subscribing for $2 a month. And it is a small price to pay, actually, when you consider that you get the entire library of Film Frat video podcasts. So it's a big deal. Everything I've ever posted on there, all 24, actually, no, not all 24. I've only recently been doing these videos, but at least 10 of them are available right now to watch as of this recording. And from here on, I will be releasing more and more video podcasts and extras on the Film Frat Patreon page at patreon.com/filmfrat. I might bring this up again, but if you are watching, I look clean, don't I? Anyway, no, that's not a concern right now. We got to focus on the matter of this episode, which is science fiction and fantasy with Michael Trigilio. He's a professor at the University of California, San Diego. I hope you're going to enjoy this conversation, because I sure did. I had him as a professor, actually, and I'm super excited to bring to you his insight, his depth of words. He's very, very conceptual, but it's really interesting to get to hear from him. So I hope you enjoy that. And his work is actually available. I'll link all of that stuff in the description, or I should say the show notes at filmfrat.com, where you can see the link to his work and you can see what he's done. He really delves into science fiction a lot into his work, and he's actually practicing Cinema 4D right now, which is a quite in-depth study of software that I am not familiar with by any means. But I've delved into some bits of software like Blender, and they are very, very hard. Now, if you're a new incoming freshman at a university, this is going to be a good episode for you, because you get to learn about what to expect out of a university professor, what types of software you might learn, which, by the way, all the Adobe stuff is included. So, and if you haven't actually seen filmfrat.com/resources.html, yeah. Anyway, that site has a link to the Adobe Creative Cloud. It's pretty popular. It's pretty common. You probably already know about it, but it's something that you'll learn and want to learn if you go to UCSD and probably elsewhere, as if you're into art school or film school. But that's not the point. Technique is just one bit of what we're going to talk about. We're also going to talk about what we can think about when making our work as our own, how we can take hold of our work and master it based on what we want to do and not what others want. Because I know personally I've had the pressure placed upon me of seeing other people's work and be like, yeah, I feel like their work is better than mine. And I'm not meeting a certain standard. And that's just not true. You shouldn't think like that. I just felt that way because of peer pressure and being in a university where we're all learning in. And some people are just naturally better than others at certain things. But it doesn't mean that we have to be exactly like them. So I encourage you just to be yourself when you're in school. This is from my words, not his words. But just be yourself. Just enjoy the experience while you can, because it doesn't last as long as you might think. Then again, I've only done 3 years instead of 4. So if you have 4 years, it might be a little bit longer for you. It might feel a little bit longer. But if you are into art school or film school right now, just take advantage of that time that you have to produce something. Produce something good that you will be proud of. So, and if it doesn't really meet that expectation that you wanted it to be, just make peace with it and try and do better next time. You know, we're all learning as we go, and we get better with every project. And that's something that actually Trigilio says. So with all that said, I hope you enjoy. This is a half theoretical, half technical conversation about science fiction and fantasy with faculty of UCSD's Visual Arts Department, Michael Trigilio. Here you go. All right, Professor Michael Trigilio is in the house. How are you, Mr. Trigilio?
I'm doing great. It's I'm literally in the house.
You are in. So am I. But we're not under the same house, unfortunately.
No, unfortunately.
We were together last quarter.
That's right.
I was under your instruction and production class.
Yep.
And it's unfortunate that I wouldn't be able to see you in person. Who would have thought?
I know, it's a drag for everyone, not to be able to kind of be in a community in person, so I think we're all trying to figure out how to do that digitally,
Yeah.
Zoom and social media and I know that, as a filmmaker and artist yourself, it's trying to find a way to make your work without being able to go to all the places you would normally go and work with people you normally work isn't easy. But I think that, like what you're doing here is a really smart way of approaching that. It's like, well, who can we talk to and how can we think about making and how we make the work we make? So it's actually a really good outlet. So I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I didn't think I would be able to interview one of my professors for the show. And I really should, because it's about student filmmaking, and this is specifically designed for people who are interested in pursuing art and media as a major and as a craft. So
great, that's perfect.
And you're one of the best candidates I have, to interview. So could you introduce yourself a little bit, like who you are as not just in UCSD but elsewhere?
Yeah, so I am a professor at UCSD in visual arts. I'm an artist, a media artist, and I do a lot of work in video, digital cinema, sound, and music. I kind of my background, my sort of early training is in music and in audio production, and a lot of that work sort of led itself to work in video and experimental film, and really integrating performance and film and video with my music and sound practice. And so when I talk about like multimedia work, it's really about this sort of integration of a lot of different strategies, all kind of in the service of ideas, right? So if it's like I have an idea for something, I try to find a way to execute it and I'm really kind of nerdy about making stuff. Like I really like to make stuff, and I collaborate a lot. But even when I collaborate, I like to really get my hands dirty and like put my hand on the tools and learn new software. I'm spending this quarantine learning Cinema 4D right now, and just playing animation and simulations, and it's it's 7 hours a day.
Sounds really complex, yeah. Cinema 4D.
It's great. It's fantastic. But it's stuff I sort of danced around with motion design and After Effects for a few years. But I thought, well, let's just dive in since you have the time and you can't go out, and it's been great. And so, but that's an example of so now a lot of my work is this sort of 3D animation work. But again, very much integrated into this sort of multimedia, sound, photography, film, video, kind of sort of web. And a lot of my work is shown in I'd say the primary venue for my work has been historically like museums and galleries, like in a fine arts context, performance festivals and music, but also a lot of I've done works with dancers and choreographers. So whether those are dance films or music for modern dance. And over the last, since 2013, I think festival, there's been more experimental underground sort of film festival type venues where I've been showing the work as there are places in San Francisco and New York and Portland and kind of around the world that are called film festivals. What they used to be, when I was starting my career, were video art festivals or video art venues. And so they're kind of broadening because so many filmmakers are looking for opportunities to screen their work, and there's so many kinds of work. There's so much work with so much breadth that there's a market for viewers and art film and movies of many kinds. And so that market has sort of opened up, and I've been screening a lot of my work in that kind of place as well. So it's very broad in terms of my approach, but that's the long and short of it, I think.
Okay.
I probably want to say about it.
No, yeah, it sounds like even lately there's been broadening a lot more with the advent of new technologies, interactive mediums, game engines, and all sorts of stuff. So I assume that there's a lot of new opportunities for students to enter into that interdisciplinary realm. What is the interdisciplinary side of things? Yeah.
Excuse me. I think this. So interdisciplinary can mean and from the arts side, right? Thinking about how to integrate work as someone who is doing work sort of with their computer at the code level, right? Sort of designing new tools, whether they be digital tools in Max MSP or PD, or whether it's working with user interfaces like Blender or C4D or After Effects. But it can also just be thinking about new ways of sort of with MakerBot and other kinds of sort of rapid prototyping of gimbals and Steadicams and motion controlled rigs. There's all kinds of innovation that young people are kind of coming up with, because the access to the resources to rent a proper motion control system is limited, and they're making Raspberry Pi and gimbal solution that will do that work for you, and so that's a hardware thing rather than a software thing. And I think really, for me, interdisciplinarity is broader than just the arts part of it, because it's also looking at psychology and looking at history and looking at critical race theory and looking at gender and and medicine, and sort of what's a broader range of disciplines that's not so much about just the making of the work, but what's my work about? Why should anyone care about this thing? And so I think some of the most interesting work that I've seen and that I'm interested in is work that's sort of blending not just strategies to make the work on the production side, but also collaborations and or just information that incorporates a broader range of thinking than the hero myth or a romantic comedy, right? There's so much more to say, and an interdisciplinary approach can include looking at cognitive psychology or looking at anthropology, as a way to think about how do we talk about our histories or our experiences, our emotions, our feelings, and relationships. Like, how can we dive deep into that, and looking at other sort of other kinds of expertise can really inspire that kind of work,
Yeah, yeah. It's really fascinating. Actually, this brings up something that I recall we were talking off air about that photo that appeared on a magazine cover of you behind this sort of analog device. That was like super cool in person. But could you talk about that work? Because that was definitely interdisciplinary, right?
Sure, yeah. So that was a piece, it was for this data science conference and called Cultured Data. And they were asking, so they had scholars who talked about data visualization and the function of data collection as something that has socio, political, economic, and cultural outcomes. And so how does data inform our dating life? How does data inform the way we eat? How does data inform the way we police? And so I was interested so I was asked to perform. And so I have a music practice, and a lot of my sound and music work is, I work with a lot of analog synthesizers and guitars and just music objects, of various kinds. Mm-hmm. And I was interested in thinking about the data. In that case, I looked at data of police killings, and there's a website called Mapping Police Violence, and I believe it might be .org, mappingpoliceviolence.org maybe. And they have they're really good data sets and data collection. And so from that, I kind of devised the structure and a score, essentially, from that material, and made a map of what I plan to do musically. But I also wanted to do some visual material for it. And so I made these animations and motion graphics works that were also either directly connected to the data, so like visualizations of some of that data, or kind of conceptually linked to the data. Some of it was, I did manipulations of old, like 1950s and 1940s police training videos, and then some animations that I had made of like lava or tar simulation with like these objects arising from them.
Right, yeah.
And so I had those playing on a sort of giant display wall as I performed the score. And so the idea is to sort of is to be connective more than communicative, right? It's that I want the audience to feel like they are understanding something on a kind of emotional, visceral, psychological level without it needing to be literally understood as like an essay. If I wanted them to read an essay, I would have written an essay.
Yeah, right.
But instead, I want them to connect on this other level of like starting soft, getting loud, cacophonous, uncomfortable, resolving, but is the resolution truly a resolution? And so that was the mixture of the sound work, the data work, and then the animation and visual work. Yeah,
it was definitely emotive. Like I could feel it. That's kind of the experience of any form of media. Like it's not just a written document; it's something that we see, we hear. It's like engaging all of our senses, right?
Yeah. That piece was called Every Pulse a Riot. And so even I wanted in the title to have this sort of like kind of implicit reaction in the title. There's a great cinematographer named Bradford Young who I really admire. And
yes, yeah.
At UCSD a few years ago, I feel like he crystallized this for me really well, which is he was someone who, he said at the time, I'll paraphrase Bradford Young, which is, he said, everyone talks to me about they love telling stories and that they are filmmakers because they want to tell stories. And Bradford Young responded to this comment he hears so often. He said, if you want to tell stories, write a book. Film is a visual medium. I'm here to make images. I'm here to make images. I'm not interested in telling stories. And I thought that was such an interesting way to crystallize sort of what we do that's different than what a novelist does or that a journalist does. Because whilst it may be part of what we do, we're not doing it by just telling the story. We're doing it by sort of creating a visual and sonic kind of poem that's meant to evoke something inside the story, rather than just tell you what the story is on the surface. And
Right.
I thought his discussion of that really illuminated that to me. And did you see that? Were you there?
Yeah, I was there. Yeah, I went to his talk.
Yeah.
It was like 2 years ago, right? I think so.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I thought
great.
that was great.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I happened to see the Triton Day 2020 video for the UCSD Visual Arts Department, and I was shocked. I was shocked to see you were the front man for that. You're the one talking about the department.
Oh, in my studio. Yeah, in
yeah,
here.
uh-huh, yeah.
Yeah, they asked me to present the department's curriculum, you know.
Yeah, and I believe you mentioned that you'll be the coordinator for the media major next year?
Oh, next year, yeah. I did that from like 2009 to 2014.
Oh.
And then I said, no more. And then Professor Cross started doing it. But he's going on sabbatical, I think. And so they said, can you do it again? I said, no. And then they said, please. And it was please with a bit of an arm twist. You know?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I will be the coordinator of the media major next year.
Great.
Fine.
That's
you know, I've done it enough. I kind of know how it works, and I know the curriculum really well. I've taught most of the classes we offer in the major. So between having done it for so long and knowing the curriculum, and I think it'll be fine.
Now, I did say off air that we're going to plug UCSD Visual Arts a little bit. So
Yeah,
for those who are interested, yeah.
They should definitely look at the visual arts department and the media major. I mean, you could put whatever you want, but a link or whatever. I don't know how, I don't know if you have a web page.
Oh yeah.
But a link to the Triton Day thing, only because I sort of talk about the major at length there and sort of what we teach and how it's different from like a traditional film school. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, could be really useful to filmmakers, especially filmmakers who are learning about film, learning student filmmakers, which is sort of what's the difference between a program like the one at UCSD and the one at USC or the one at Florida State, or like there's so many approaches to teaching this material, and so without going through that entire like 20-minute discussion, I will say our primary approach is really asking you to think about kind of stuff I touched on earlier, like what is it that you're making and why are you making it? Like what's your voice? Like who are you as an artist? What do you want to say? The tools that you use to make the work are going to be changing every 9 to 18 months. There are things that I taught when I started my teaching career. I taught Premiere. This was before Premiere Pro. Premiere 6.5, it was called.
Oh, wow.
I taught a version of Flash that's now called Animate that no longer exists. I taught a version of Pro Tools before Avid bought it, right? There are all these things that I taught that are no longer useful. So all those students took those classes with me that were just technique based. They were just how to use Pro Tools, how to use After Effects, how to use Photoshop. Photoshop is more or less the same. How to use Premiere. And all of that material is kind of dead. Like that's money down the tubes. The students who paid to study that with me. In the moment, it felt really good because they learned how to use Premiere 6.5. That was before the advent of HD, certainly before the advent of like accessible CG or 3D modeling software. It was before stereo or like stereo video or VR or 360 video. Like it was all like standard definition digital video. And I remember these lessons. It's like the back of my head. 720 by 534 is the aspect ratio for motion graphics. Like, I know all these things that like people memorize, and like you would never know that. You would never need to know that now. Like it doesn't matter at all. We don't use those aspect ratios anymore. We don't use 4:3 unless we're shooting 16 millimeter. Like there's so many things we don't even think about. And so it's like, well, what could I have taught that was actually more meaningful? Like that would stick with the student longer, that would allow them to be a filmmaker and still have value in what it was, in the relationship, their learning relationship with me. And a lot of that material is what we do in the media major, which is sort of like, well, what are you making? And like, what are the tropes or what are the cliches? And how do you apply some specific ideas to a specific scene? How do you think about pacing? How do you think about movement? How do you think about light? There's technique in all of that, but the technique is kind of grounded in like, what are your ideas, rather than here's a technique. And I equate it often to like carpentry and writing. So if I'm a writer and I'm like, and I go to it and I say I want to study writing in a writing department, and I show up and like, teach me how to write. The first thing they're gonna ask me is like, well, are you a journalist? Are you a poet? Are you a screenwriter? I'm like, no, don't ask me those questions. I want to just know how to write. I want to be a good writer. Well, do you want to write technical manuals? Are you an engineer? I'm a writer. Like, it's absurd. Like, it's absurd as I it's absurd. You would always begin with, well, if you're a poet, you will write, here are some strategies. But if you're a journalist, here's some other strategies. And there's an infinite range therein, right? And I think that, we're in carpentry. I want to be a carpenter. Well, yeah, so what do you want to make now? I want to learn all the tools. Okay, but what do you want? Do you want to make a coffee table? I want to first learn all the tools, and then I will decide what to make. No one learns carpentry that way. You say, I want to make a coffee table, and then someone tells you you need a hammer and a saw. I don't know how to make a coffee. I don't know carpentry. But I know enough, and I know enough carpenters. I have a really good friend who's a carpenter. And I ran this by him before I started talking about it. I know enough to know that you kind of got to learn by doing it. And the only way you learn by doing is having an idea and being like, well, is this worth doing? I'll try it. And so like I'm learning Cinema 4D, not just to learn it. I'm like trying out ideas I've got, and I'm learning every day. But I think if I just did 45 tutorials a day, I wouldn't really learn anything. I will learn how to do those tutorials, but it wouldn't, And so part of what I'm trying to apply to myself is what I try to teach in my classes, which is, what are you thinking about? What are you interested in? What do you care about? What's interesting to you visually, aesthetically, philosophically, that you might explore using these tools, and now you begin to use them and learn them. And that's really the approach we take. Long answer, but not as long as the answer I gave Triton.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. If they want a more in-depth answer, they can just look at the show notes, which I will attach in the show notes. So I'll attach that.
In the show notes.
Anyway, so because UCSD Visual Arts is known to be a little bit more conceptual, a little bit more experimental, there are some class titles that might throw people off a little bit. Like, what the heck is that? Like, for example, the class that I was in with you last quarter, which is called Strategies of Alterity. Now, what the heck does alterity mean? I may ask.
No one knows. Alterity, this is a class title that was sort of created in the early 2000s, maybe late 90s, early 2000s, and it was part of a sort of an A and a B, right? And so the A is strategies of self, meaning how do you look at self-portraiture, putting yourself on camera, doing work about your family, your culture, your body, your feelings, and what are some strategies to approach self-portraiture? There's a vast art historical tradition and film tradition of filmmakers and artists who point the camera at themselves, whether that's the painterly image, the mirror, or it's literally, Charlie Kaufman and, Woody Allen or something, where they're pointing the camera at themselves, right? And they're thinking about, how do I present my persona on screen? Well, what's the opposite of self? The other, right? But a fancy way of saying the other is alterity. And so, the strategies of the self, it's strategies of the them. And I think strategies of the them didn't sound as good in the course catalog, probably, in 1998. And so they said strategies of alterity. And the thing is, whenever anyone teaches either of these classes, they kind of bring the faculty member who teaches it brings their own approach, right? So, when one professor teaches strategies of alterity, they may be focusing entirely on questions of migration and other parts of the world, and what is it to be looking at, or histories and post-colonial theory, and what is it to be indigenous versus non-indigenous, a resident of a place, and how do we look at those others as makers? How do we look at the indigenous as ourselves or as the other? My approach was to look at, I think the subtitle was Sci-Fi Other World Space. and to think about alterity of being the sort of subject of the other, the alterity being sort of off planet. What is it to think about not human and not Earth driven, but interplanetary, alien, off world, the void, and what kinds of interesting ideas can we summon from thinking about the other there, and how does that reflect back on our own values, right? Sort of when we start to imagine the other, we begin to articulate something about what we believe about ourselves. That when I say, well, out there's got to be a species that, I don't know, doesn't eat, and instead it survives by absorbing light. Okay, great. Now, why did I think of that one? Am I worried about food? Am I about, like, how did that come through? And what does it make me think about humans and their consumption and the way we relate to food and survival and the things we do to survive and the things that we kill to survive, and including the food that we eat, the plants and the minerals and the animals and the planet. And so it becomes an interesting way of thinking about us to focus it out there. And so that was the class you took, was my version of Alterity, which is very science fiction, sort of imagining off-world.
Right, yeah. And when I think of world building, I think of the article we read in class about Mass Effect. And how that includes world building. And funny enough, I just started playing the game like 2 weeks ago, and I can see now how the world building plays out. And it's so fascinating that you can talk to almost anybody you want. And you have these dialogue trees of sorts. And that really...
Which one are you playing, 1 or 2? Or
1.
3?
I'm starting from 1.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. So when I think of world building,
It's the only game... I think I mentioned this to you earlier this year, which is, I think it's the only game I've ever finished. I think the only game I've played all the way through is Mass Effect. I played all 3 of them, and I enjoyed them. And Portal, I played Portal 2, maybe, and I finished that. And then I own dozens and dozens and dozens of games. My wife is an avid gamer, so she plays all the games all the way through all the time. I am not. My patience for games is really low, but Mass Effect really captured my imagination, and that article is a major factor, I think, in why I stayed with it and didn't get burned out, because of the way it asks you to think about all of these other cultures and all of these other planets as really being central to the world of the game, and humanity is not the center of the universe. And I think that really serves your investment. It's not that as the human you show up and you're like, "You're welcome, everybody. The humans here." Like that game works. The humans are just one of many races, and they're not that big of a deal. And I think that becomes a really interesting. And when you begin to look at like the Solarians and the Krogans, and their dynamic is very fraught and interesting, and the tensions there, and I think that's the name of the species. I haven't played this game in like a decade.
Solarians is correct. I don't know about the other ones, but
the Krogans. I think they're called the Krogans.
Okay.
Oh, I just heard from another room. Yes, they're called the Krogans. And I love that dynamic. And so, and humanity's not part of the dynamic, and it's a very dramatic and interesting dynamic. And the human is just kind of a bystander. It's just sort of like you're learning about it, but you're not central to it. You're not. Your history and your humanity and your humanness is not going to be the thing that changes anything between these two species. It's a captivating aspect of the world building that is about which humanity is not central, right? It's that its centrality is specific to this species dynamic, and it's fascinating, and you're invested, but you're not invested as like, okay, and here I come as the savior, or here I come to solve the problem. Calm down, human.
Right. Yeah.
You don't know. This has been going on a lot longer than your species has been walking, you know? And I think that it does something that I think like Star Trek does at its best, but not all the time, which is sort of allows for civilizations to exist that don't know about human beings and don't really care about human beings. And so it allows us not to have this burden as the player or as the viewer, if it's Star Trek, of like, well, how are we going to help? How are we going to solve them? What are we going to do? What should we do? No one cares. You don't need to do anything. Like, and so I think that in certain kinds of sci-fi properties, like sometimes in Star Trek and certainly in Mass Effect, it raises these interesting questions about like, well, what do we perceive our role to be as San Diegans or Californians or Americans or humans, right? Like, what is it? It asks us to ask those questions implicitly because we're looking at this other world, and it's an entertaining way and an imaginative way to kind of get there.
Yeah. And some people might be confused when they think about fantasy versus sci-fi. Could you talk about the difference between the two?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you how I perceive the difference. And I think there are probably, I know that there are scholars and historians and writers and nerds and all kinds of people who will have better definitions than any of mine. But I think that the way I would articulate it would be that both science fiction and fantasy kind of deal with magic of some kind. And in science fiction, that magic is often a technological magic. It's a make-believe technology. It's warp drive and faster than light speed and ray guns and teleportation. And it's a magic of engineering and kind of tools and spaceships, right? And that the magic of fantasy is a magic of the natural world. So it is a magic of dragons and of sorcery and of spells and of potions. And neither magic is inferior or superior to the other. They're just two ways of talking about the exact same thing. A teleportation spell and a teleportation machine are both magic, right? Neither exist.
Yeah.
Imagining them. But the spell is also born of a different lineage and a different history and a different kind of set of cultural traditions and cultural assumptions about the natural world and about our relationships to our bodies and the earth. And oftentimes they're gendered in ways that are, I think, useful to identify, that they are maybe inaccurate, appropriately gendered, but the tool making and the engineering can be gendered male very quickly by readers or makers. And the fantasy of magic and its groundedness in the natural world can be gendered very easily in femininity. I think this would probably be a distortion of what these magics really are. And I think there are obviously, infinite number of examples that show us how these classifications aren't really accurate or useful. But I think it can be useful to look at how then tropes show up, that the way in which the technologies of magic have a corollary to technologies of war making or technologies of innovation that we see in a society that favors the work of men, and that the technology of magic, which is sometimes sort of contextualized, often by male authors, as feminine, can be understood as having this other value, right? As of being nurturing or being like a love potion, right? Is something that we think of as magic, and there isn't really like a love gun in science fiction, and I don't think that's an accident, because I think there's a way in which human beings are making all this up, and human beings bring their own biases and their own points of view and their own blind spots to this work. And so by making some works of fantasy driven by emotion or driven by desire or driven by greed or driven by feelings, there's a way in which the blind spot is there, as if the teleportation device isn't driven by feelings, the feeling to escape or the feeling to get there. But we're not shown those stories, right? If I had a teleport, I would teleport based on feelings 95% of the time.
Right.
I would have family meetings. I would be like out to dinner with my dad. I'd be like, oh, beam me up, Scotty, get me the fuck out. Like, I'm done. Right? There would be nothing but emotional-based teleporting in that case. But those are not the stories we're told. We're told stories that are very utilitarian about technologies of magic that are like, well, we need to go faster than light speed in order to get from this point to that point, so we'll use it. And it's not based on like, but I want to, I want to capture the magic of the moment, or I want to avoid this trauma, or I want to be in touch with this feeling. These really reductive ways of understanding science fiction and fantasy, I think, don't serve either genre. Someone who isn't, I'm not as fluent in fantasy. I'm fantasy adjacent. You know, I've watched a number of fantasy kind of movies and shows, but it's not a genre that I like and invested in as a viewer and a reader. But I think that the reduction of them to one is doing one thing and one is doing the other, I think is probably a distortion. I think they're doing a lot of the same things. I think spaceships and dragons are the same thing, right?
Yeah.
I just think that
definitely
one's a dragon.
Right.
And that means something else, especially to the person making it.
Yeah, like it comes back to the idea, that initial idea that you have as an artist, right? You know, that's what that's grounded from there.
And what it drives you, you know. I mean, I think that it's really inspiring. Like, there's something really beautiful about a creature that hasn't existed and can't exist, but is powerful and magical and sort of impossibly powerful. There's something kind of amazing about that, right? Like, that's very compelling. And in science fiction, we might say, oh, great, yeah, that's an alien, right? Because there's this desire to put a logic onto it, a science logic onto it, map that on. And I think fantasy is a bit more liberated than that. And it says, no, this is just here. It's a Pegasus or it's a dragon. And it's here. It's here in this Earth or an Earth adjacent like world. And I think that's a very liberated way of thinking about it. It doesn't require resources, right? It isn't based in capitalism. I have to raise money to build a spaceship. Lives in a mountain. I don't know where dragons live. A cave? Under the sea? I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
I can't make one, so it sort of beats the market economy at that point. And I think that's a very revolutionary idea.
That's very interesting. Yeah. For some reason I'm trying to think of something that kind of blurs the lines between these two. And I think of an anime called Evangelion, you know?
Man, you're the second person who's mentioned that to me in like 2 weeks. Mention it. I know Evangelion only because there's a photographer from the late 90s I really liked, whose name I do not remember now, who took a bunch of photos of Evangelion figurines in front of these beautiful abstract landscapes. And I loved them so much. And then I tried to watch Evangelion and I couldn't really get into it. But I know enough about it to think that maybe you're onto something because of its blending of technology and magic.
Right.
Creatures.
Especially the aliens in the show, which are kind of deemed as angels, are otherworldly. Like, they just suddenly appear onto planet Earth.
Yeah.
With no, at least in the beginning, there's no specific purpose that we can gauge why they got involved on Earth. And
yeah.
It's fascinating.
I will have to watch it, Zach, because I had another student write to me recently, and it was like, I think you would like it. You got to check it out. Not really. I have a hard time with anime, and it's only because I feel like I'm not fluent in its visual strategies, and so I find it jarring to watch. My failing. It's not the failing of anime, but it's so unfamiliar. The way like an experimental film might be difficult for someone to watch because they don't know what the fuck they're looking at. The heck they're looking at. You can bleep me if you need to. Sorry.
No. This is falling out of my ear.
Okay. But if I feel that way about some kinds of popular media, including especially anime, because I'm watching it. I'm like, I just don't feel conversant as a visual consumer in what I'm seeing, and so it feels chaotic to me. But I need to overcome that because it's such a mainstream and popular form, and I think there are probably things I would really love. I've seen like the really famous one, like I've seen Akira,
yeah.
Shell, obviously. And I've seen the big mainstream popular like movies,
Yeah.
But but Evangelion, Neo Genesis, is that the same?
Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Neon Genesis, yeah. I haven't seen that. I mean, I do think Star Wars is a kind of blending of science fiction and fantasy because you have so much magic in it, and an emphasis on the magic is so important in it that, and the magic is non-technological, right? That you have a fantasy component that is kind of based in the natural world, and that I think is an interesting blend, though it really leans into its technology with all of its design. But I think there's a I think a pretty good blend, and people, I think a lot of space opera works kind of find a blend there because there's the mysterious, and how do you talk about the mysterious beyond something that was just made that was very advanced? You kind of get to like there be dragons.
Yeah, it's fantasy. Yeah, that's because of the Force and the midichlorians, for example, right? That's the fantasy aspect. It's just kind of funny to me. I still hear the words of Qui-Gon in my mind right now. The midichlorians, they bind all things together, you know? It's very abstract.
It's so funny.
It's very abstract.
It is. It is, yeah. I know you and I have
feelings about it.
We have an internal disagreement about one of the Star Wars Last Jedi that we disagree about.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm still like debating on that.
It's okay. I think that's the beautiful thing about any of these works of art is that they're up for lots of discussion and debate. But I think that movie's probably a masterpiece.
It was a good movie. I'm not sure if it was in the top for me, but yeah. Anyway, we're not going to get into that too much.
That's okay.
For those students who are into science fiction, fantasy, and they want to replicate some of these effects, like CG, we're talking about CG. What are the tools available to students today that you would recommend them learn?
So I think there's a software approach and a kind of like production approach. And I think both, they kind of have to go hand in hand, right? And I think the software approach would be you kind of have to know Photoshop and After Effects. You have to learn something fundamental about essentially compositing an image, right? Taking an image, thinking about this is going to be in the foreground, and I shot this independently of what I shot that I'm going to put in the background. And when I lay them on top of each other, it's a seamless image. That, I think, is such a fundamental, both historically and to this very day in modern like films made this year, the way the impossible is made possible. Taking two things shot independently and laying them, not cutting them together, but laying them on top of each other and blending them seamlessly with each other. And so one of the ways that I think could be really useful to begin thinking about it is to think about like when you take a camera out into the world, even if just a photo camera or your DSLR or a video camera, and just camera off and find a shot where you can really distinguish a foreground and a middle ground and a background. Maybe it's in a parking garage. Maybe it's in front of a grocery store. I know during quarantine and stuff, maybe it's in front of your garage in your house. Mm-hmm. And as little motion as possible, really, so that you can begin to generate something called plates. You can have a background plate. You can have a foreground plate. And the more you can think about that, then in Photoshop, you can begin to sort of cut out, well, in the foreground, I have the car. And in the background, I've got the parking garage. And in even further background, I've got the sky. And if you can begin to separate that one image into car, garage, sky, you can do a lot. Because now you can have things flying around in the deep background in the sky. You can have things floating around in the garage. And you can have something happening in the car. And you can begin to build your image not as a sequence of images, but as a stack of images moving towards and away from the viewer. And so, you know, if we think of sort of visual effects and special effects as kind of like tricking the eye, right? That you can, I think if you learn something about light, that could be really useful. That if I want to make it seem like there's fire in front of me, well, maybe I don't shoot the fire, I just shoot me, but I flash some light with a gel on it, orange and yellow light, and I flicker the light in front of me, and I just see my face reacting to orange and yellow light, and then I composite some flames in front of me, it'll look like I'm being lit by the flames.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
about not just the shot, but also what can I do to the shot, to the plate of the body or of the flames to do that. And so I think anyone sort of starting thinking about how would I begin to, I would look up, like, even on your, on your website or on websites like the ones you link to, I would look at, the way I've learned it is by doing it and watching like every behind the scenes video I've ever seen on any science fiction movie I've ever watched. I would look up things like matte paintings and glass matte paintings and garbage mats and traveling mats. And there's so many great videos online now that kind of explain the technology without it being software specific, and just like, here's how it works. It's kind of a puzzle. It's kind of like it's almost like figuring out like a magic trick. And once you figure out like, oh, it's all a little disappointing too, right? When you realize like, oh, so all they did was just cut out, and then they just, oh my God. It's always a little bit like when you watch a magic trick, how it was done. You're like, oh, so he's just holding on to it like in his sleeve. You're right? It's a bit disappointing, but the magic of it is like, you don't know. And I like to ruin that magic for myself as a maker. And it's my favorite thing about any of these movies. Every time I watch a science fiction movie, I say, I can't wait for I can't wait for the special features. I watched some movie recently and I'm like, I'm much more into the special features for this movie than I was in the movie. And that's true for a lot of these big science fiction films. So I want to know how they do it. I would also look at Cinefex magazine, which is a journal that comes out quarterly. Cinefex, Cinefex. And basically the history of that magazine started in 1979, 1980. I think its first issue was Empire Strikes Back and Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And it's still published today. I think their last issue looked at The Mandalorian and the Rise of Skywalker. The Rise of Skywalker.
The Rise of Skywalker.
And basically, it's a masterclass in the history of visual effects and special effects. And it's every 3 months they do like 4 films, and it's a breakdown of how they did every effect shot, cinematography, visual effects, special effects, costume, light, interviews with the designers, the photographers. So I mean, and you can get the entire archive on their app. I know it sounds like I'm promoting them. I don't work for them right now.
That sounds really good.
The entire archive is available. I just go, and sometimes I'm just like, I'm not sure what to read. I'm like, I don't want to read the next book on my list. I'll just go and buy like an issue from like 1996 and just see how do they make Armageddon, or something like some shit movie that I want to see how do they do the asteroids. And you go and read it, and it's every one of them is amazing. And so it's like, but what it does is it gets you inculcated in the thinking of how is this magic trick done? Like, how did they solve this problem of making it really appear like Superman's flying through the air? How did they make little BB-8 roll around on the ground? Like, how did they do it? And that piece of it can become for a filmmaker, it's not just intellectual. Then it's like, I'm going to try. And I think that's the journey I've taken, and I think that you and filmmakers take, which is, it's not just, oh, that's cool. It's, I want to do it. So then I'm going to get my camera, and I'm going to put a green glove on my hand, and I'm going to push a ball around, and I'm going to see if I can key out my hand and make it look like the ball's rolling around. Like, I'm going to try it and for no reason, right?
Yeah.
If you can get in the habit of just like trying shit out, especially with visual effects, and knowing they're going to look terrible 95% of the time, you will learn so much about how to do these things. And when you read these interviews, like in Cinefex or anywhere, you'll see that's how they're doing it too. Like, they're just trying shit out. They're just throwing things at the wall. How do we make an X-Wing fighter fly through the air? I don't know, man. Let's try making a little one. Let's make a big one. Let's do it with an anime. How do we do it? I don't know. Let's try this. Let's move the camera. Let's move the ship. And you just see that process. And I think, oh, I want to try it. Let me try that. So it's After Effects and Photoshop and camera, but it's also like just practice, like playing the piano.
Yeah, very true. And now, while these technical tools are really important, what would you say is the most important aspect of production? Because these are all great, and say someone masters Blender or masters Premiere, After Effects, and they can like supposedly work in Hollywood as, I don't know, a rotoscope artist. No, don't do that. But say they master the technical side. It is, but I'm sure.
If you wanna like work in like meat factory conditions.
Sure. What is the most important part of production besides all these things?
Zach, I'm not sure I have an answer for what's the most important. I think something you can never lose sight of is, and the way I often think about it is like if you go to your Netflix queue or Netflix, my list on Netflix, and you see all the movies that are there that you haven't watched yet, and all the movies that you could watch, and you're like, that looks shitty. That's not going to be good. Every one of those movies is a professionally made, expensive ass movie. Like every action film on there, every science fiction film. I've seen a bunch of not good science fiction films on Netflix, a bunch. Movies that like no one cares about, no one talks about, they're not good. And the visual effects are spot on. They're great. They're great visual effects, great cinematography. And so the way I often think about it is like having something that looks professional and really works and really just like you sell the image gets you to zero. It gets you to no, like, who cares? And I think you've got to find a way to get past it looks like a real film. This is sort of like this is something that parents are a problem. Because when I started doing music, I would make all this music and my parents were like, oh, it sounds like a real song. Okay, but is it good?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but that's not what we're looking for. We're not looking for it sounds like a real song. We want to know, is it Hey Jude or whatever? Is it a good song? You know?
Yeah.
And I think that we sometimes fall into a trap where like getting it to look like a real movie or a real visual effect can sometimes make us think that's worth caring about, and it really isn't. That gets you to, so now that I believe that the spaceship is flying and landing on the moon, who's flying the spaceship? Like, why is it on the moon? What's there? Like, why do I give a fuck? I'm sorry to cuss. Why do I care at all? You know?
Yeah.
And I think that's where you don't want to lean so hard into only knowing how to do stuff and never knowing why you're doing it, that you distort and you have a limp in your art practice where you're like, I'm really technically good, but I have no ideas. And I think the reason that's important is that whenever you submit your portfolio for a job, you have to kind of assume everybody's got really good skills. Like once you're great at making a thing, you join the ranks of everyone who's great at making a thing. And so what sets you apart? Well, you're interesting. That's what sets you apart. That you showed me this in a way I haven't seen it before. When I see your space elevator, or when I see your spaceship, or I'm thinking of a film you made with the pod on the ocean, right? When I see your pod, I'm like, oh, that's a way, I've not seen it that way before. That's an interesting way to look at it. I like that way of looking at it, that design approach, that visual approach. That's interesting. As opposed to like yet another thing that technically it works, but like, why am I invested? Why do I care? And that can be just visual. Like it doesn't always have to be story-based. But it can be a design approach. And there are a lot of designers who are, that's their genius, is making us care about what I'm seeing because it's interesting to look at, So I think that would be to me the most important piece on like what we're making. And I think the only thing that competes with most important is just like practice and make work. Like there's not an easy, you have to just do it every day. Like you just have to make work every day. Or as much as you can. Like, don't have a social life.
Yeah.
Don't, try to eat well and, be a decent being. But like, you just have to, like, there's no like, I will make the work once I get to this point is an illusion. You will make the work once you start making the work, period. And so that, there's not some threshold you will cross that will be the threshold that will then allow you to begin making the things that you dream of making. You either make them now or begin working on them now, right? And knowing that they will change and they will grow and you will grow. But waiting to make it once I have enough money, once I have enough collaborations, once I have enough skills, that's something we're telling ourselves to protect ourselves from not having to do the scary thing. And that's huge. So it's sort of like two most important things tied, which is like ideas are important. You got to be creative also, and you got to work hard. So they're integrated,
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah. And it's my last question. Thanks again for all these great
Oh
answers,
yeah, of
by
course.
the way. It was amazing.
Yeah.
And this might overlap a little bit with that last question, but
Yeah.
what advice would you give to freshmen, incoming freshmen into an art school or film school who want to stand out in their craft and actually pursue filmmaking long term? It's a very broad and hard question, but
Well, it's not. Yeah, I mean, that's just. I would say so much. You know me. I'm a bit of a talker, so I would probably go on at length. I'd probably bore them to death. But I think some of what I said before. I think something about like you can get started right now. Like, and I've said this to you probably, Zach. Like you don't really have to go to college for any of this. Like you can just do this. I know it's not the part promoting UCSD visual arts I was supposed to do, but. Like that's the secret, right? The secret that I'm not supposed to tell you is that like you can just learn how to do this stuff, and you can just make the stuff. So then, well, then why are we doing it? Why are we going to college? Well, there are some reasons that there's something you can get out of it. The first is you can get community, right? You can find other artists, and you can be like, hey, fellow artists, I want to work on this thing. Can you help me? Can I help you? What do you think of this? And it's someone who's not your mom. Or your dad or your family is going to be like, oh, it looks like a real film. They'll be like, yeah, I don't care about it. Somebody can be brutally honest with you, and you trust them because they're also making work. That's the first thing I would say is important to do, is try to find other people who'd like to do the things you like to do, who are excited about what you like to do. The second thing is I would just begin making I would say the thing with the threshold. Like you can begin, start. If you have a phone, do you have a computer, it's got a laptop camera, go. Make the film that you want to make. And know that they're not that you will get better as you make more and as you collaborate with your community. I think so I would say that kind of like the earlier answer I gave. So community, practicing or just making the work. And then I would say take advantage of like, do work that like do what you like, right? I think I have a lot of students who study in visual arts media who don't really seem to like art or film or like making work. And I'm like, well, you might be happier doing something else. Do a thing you like to do, you don't have to do this. And I do it still. I'm learning, I'm learning software now. No one's asking me to learn Cinema 4D. No one cares. No one really cares if I do anything ever again, right? But like I do it because I'm really into it. It's like my whole thing. I'm really into it, right? And so I would like get into something. Like what is it you're into? And then maybe I'm into photography. Of what? Do you photograph fashion? Do you photograph landscapes? Do you like to photograph textures? Do you like to photograph different lighting environments? Like, what are you into? Like, you don't have to get dogmatically like I only photograph textures. You what's your thing? Like, who do you like? Like, what other artists do you like? And I think if you can get excited about stuff, it makes those other two pieces easier. It makes the community part easier because it's like, I met so-and-so, and they're also really into photography, but they don't like textures. They photograph fashion. But we work together, and lots of fashion has textures. And it's like, that is huge. And if you're really into stuff, then the making things makes it easier. Because if you're really excited about, then you're like, I want to go and try this. I want to go and try this. I'm going to go out this weekend and shoot. I'm going to go out this weekend. I'm going to go learn this thing in computer and try this. And so it's like these three pieces of like, get excited about something, and just let yourself be vulnerable. Be like, I don't know why it is, but I love working with the human body and getting close up on hands and feet and body parts. And I know it's weird and I can't show my parents, but like, I'm really into it. But like my community of fellow artists are saying it's really interesting and I'm working every day on it and I'm producing this work. Like that's ideal. And it may be that mom and dad don't ever really get what you're doing or your family. And I think that's the thing we have to kind of figure out as first year freshman students is like, how do we distinguish our practice from what's going to make grandma happy at Thanksgiving? And I'm a big fan of ruining Thanksgiving.
That's good. It's really good. Well, thanks again for all your
You're welcome.
your
I hope
advice.
it's useful to your podcast.
Oh, definitely. And where can people find some of your work online?
They can go to, I have a website that I share with a cousin who's a poet and a scholar in Chicago called starve.org. So starve.org. And Tony Trigilio's a poet and writer. And so if you want to learn about contemporary poetry and the beats, you can go to his section. If you want to look at my work and see my portfolio and kind of everything I've been doing, you can click on my name and you can see all that. So starve.org is an easy place to find my stuff.
Perfect.
Also, arts.ucsd.edu website has my teaching shit. So if you're at UCSD or you're interested in UCSD and you want to learn more about that, you can always reach out to me and email me, and I will probably get back to you, not within 24 hours, but I will get back to you. I got back to Zach, so I'll get back to you.
Yeah, there you go. And I will attach that in the show notes as well. All right. Thanks, Mr. Trigilio. You're a pleasure to have here. And it's
good to talk to you. Thanks, Zach.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I know I had a good time talking to him. And if you want to see more of his work, again, you can see his work over at filmfrat.com/show-notes. The links to his website is there. His other information, again, the video of Triton Day 2020 from UCSD, which is actually posted by the Visual Arts Department. Again, he's going to be the coordinator of the media major next year. So if you're new to UCSD or you're already in there, expect to see him on campus. He's an amazing guy, and I hope you get the chance to have a class with him. He's great, and I learned a lot from him. So, anywho, thank you guys so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this podcast episode. Remember that you can see all the stuff again on filmfrat.com/show-notes for the video links, and everything else mentioned in this episode. And remember, you can see the video versions of these podcasts over at patreon.com/filmfrat, all one word. All right, guys, thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll be back in 2 more weeks. If you have any questions, by the way, I forgot to mention this in the last episode, but if you have any questions for me as a student, I'm going to be graduating pretty soon, next month actually. So if you have any questions about what it was like at UCSD, like I said, you could email Michael Trigilio at the email provided in the show notes. But if you want, you can also email me at zach@filmfrat.com. So please shoot me some questions, and you can also follow us on Instagram at filmfrat. And if you have any questions, just hand them over. I'd be happy to tackle those. And it's been a journey. It's been a really long journey, and I'm not going to get into my goodbye speech for UCSD right now, but eventually I'll have to say goodbye, sadly, because I really enjoyed my experience at UCSD. I actually can't believe it's already ending. So just make the most of this time. If you are a current student right now, take advantage of this time. It goes by so fast. It's crazy. But anyway, I don't want it to end on a down note, so enjoy it while you can and make work that you are proud of. Remember that you are gifted, you are creative, and you are able. Talk to you later, Film Frat.
That's all from this episode of the Film Fraternity Podcast. For more filmmaking tips and tricks you can use on your next project, visit www.filmfrat.com. That's FILMFRAT.com.